The martial arts is quite a spectrum, I would say. It covers a lot of physical aspects, mental aspects, even emotional aspects. It can influence one's life in both positive and negative ways if done correctly and or incorrectly. It covers such a spectrum, but what really defines a martial art? Where is the line drawn between a sport and a martial art? I'm going to go a little more in depth with that in this first episode of Knowledge Drop with me, Greg Laurel. So, martial art. Let's just first dissect that word in and of itself, that concept. So martial literally just means military. For example, martial law, military law, when a military takes over the governing body. Well, that's more a coup, but that's not what I'm talking about right now. A martial art is, by its core definition, a set of combative techniques generally first pioneered and used by a militaristic force, either for the purpose of conquest or defense. A lot of martial arts you see nowadays is used for either tournament or self-defense, and sometimes they are used strictly for tournament. Some schools will just teach you how to fight in a ring, and that's their choice, it's perfectly legitimate still. And others will teach you how to fight for your life on the streets. That's usually what I train in. I train in the martial arts of karate and eskrima currently. I've also studied Wing Chun and historical European martial arts, as well as some sport fencing on the side, specifically saber, because that's twice as fun as epee or foil. And epee or foil you can only poke, saber you can slash or poke at, so twice the fun. Now, fencing itself is a sport, but it does have techniques that were grounded in martial arts, but fencing itself is a sport. So where within even just fencing do we see martial arts or just a sport? Because you're wielding a sword. Make no mistake, that's a sword in your hand. Even if you're just doing epee or foil. That's still a sword, and it's still ingrained in techniques that were used to wield a rapier or a small sword. A saber, same basic principle. Techniques that were meant to use a slashing sword that could also poke, like a saber. Like maybe even a cutlass, but that would be more gross and necessary fencing, but even so. And in historical European martial arts, you see a lot of the using weapons that were designed less for sport and more for combat. But one could even argue that the foil could be used in combat because its techniques are basically small sword. So wherein do we draw that line between a sport and a martial art? Or is there even a line, I wonder? Is there even a line, or is it like a spectrum? Because sure, you'll see some things that would work in a ring, but would never work on the street or in the battlefield. For example, you've got stuff in traditional martial arts that look great to judges on the form. Those are your acrobatics, your gymnastic stuff that you would really only realistically use as kind of a coup de grace when it comes to battlefield or one-on-one combat. Taking, for example, the wheel kick. The wheel kick is one in which you strike with the heel of your foot by basically turning your entire body around and hitting them with the heel. It's used a lot in media. You see it a lot where the guy spins around and tries to smash a guy with his heel. That's usually called a wheel kick. Realistically, I would only ever use that as a coup de grace. I'm not going to open with a wheel kick. Like, a good example of opening with a wheel kick was in The Matrix Reloaded, where when some agents attack our hero Neo, and one of them goes right up and goes straight for that wheel kick to the jaw. It's good at first surprise, sure, but I'd probably never do it against another trained opponent. I might do it against someone who has no idea what they're up against, and I've got all the time in the world to get that ready. Now then, a martial art is a military art. You're generally learning, especially if you're in a self-defense studio, you're learning how to fight on the street. You're learning how to fight for your life. The exception to this is when you're fighting for a tournament and you're learning that at that school. There are usually schools divide themselves among that. But a martial art is ingrained in battlefield combat. So that's where you're going to see, like, So some people would argue that the most true martial art nowadays is the martial art that is known as Krav Maga, pioneered by the Israeli Special Forces. It's absolutely not a sport art. It is totally meant to kill your opponent. Make no mistake. If you're learning Krav Maga, you are learning deadly stuff. And I hope they make that clear on day one, that you're learning deadly stuff, because that's the point of Krav Maga. The point of Krav Maga is as true to life training as possible. And one could argue that that's the one remaining true martial art nowadays. But I wouldn't say that devalues other martial arts, because they all have their place. Each has its own strengths and weaknesses. Some of them hybridize strengths and weaknesses to form another. Like judo is a sport, but it derives its combat techniques from jiu-jitsu, which is itself a martial art, a grappling martial art that makes up for the flaws that karate might have, where it doesn't have a lot of ground game. And that's where you see a lot of people that say, oh, jiu-jitsu is the best because no one ever expects you to take them to the ground all of a sudden. But if somebody knows what they're doing against a jiu-jitsu guy, even if not on the ground, they're still going to be in a lot of trouble, because I believe there was one UFC fight where the guy was a very big jiu-jitsu guy, so he just laid on the ground and was like, please come over here and try to take me on the ground. And when you're a one-trick horse, that just, ugh, I never liked one-trick horses. Horses are cool, but not really one-trick kinds. But some people do wonder when they're going to martial arts, which one should I choose? That really does depend on what you want to do, on what you want to get out of it. Are you looking to get fit? Well, in that case, what was it? It wasn't Shotokan, unless it was Shotokan. Yeah, well, if you want to get fit, a Shotokan style karate, or even like wrestling or jiu-jitsu will definitely get you fit. If you want taekwondo, will absolutely get you fit. You cannot have a beer gut and do taekwondo. It's just not possible. One of my instructors, I believe, held a 4th or 5th degree black belt in taekwondo. You cannot have a gut and do taekwondo. It's just not possible. You just can't do it. You can't. You just can't, so don't even try. Well, do try to do martial arts though, but don't try to have a gut and do taekwondo at the same time, because that would be silly and impossible. Now then, if what you're looking for is to be able to fight on the street and fight for your life, find a good Krav Maga place. They'll teach you very well how to defend yourself. If you're also, all martial arts have their place in self-defense. There's no one true martial art. They all have their strengths, they all have their weaknesses. I'm even going to do another episode later on the concept of mixed martial arts and how brilliant of an idea it is. But that's for another episode. And when you're looking for this, make no mistake, you're also starting a journey. Like, this could be a lifelong journey you're on. Because it could take many years of your life that, let's be frank, would you be really doing anything better? But then again, is it really for everyone? I think everyone should at least try it. Because everyone should at least have a basic understanding on how to defend themselves. Because even if you're not a self-defense kind of guy, I feel like you should at least have some knowledge. So that way at least you've got something. You've got something and nothing else. You're not just flinging your fists all over the place like an absolute madman like you see in some of those YouTube videos that I find absolutely hilarious. And that I sometimes shout at, "You're doing it all wrong!" But I digress. When you start this journey, when you enroll in a studio, when you put on the white belt or don the uniform or whatever, if you're doing Krav Maga doesn't really use belts, so whenever you start, there's a definitive sort of, the path has started, and ideally your instructor will show you the door for you to walk through as you make your progression through this. Now, personally, I have not yet earned my Shodan or first degree black belt. I'll be frank, I'm first Q, 1 belt away. My black belt test is in June of this year. And I mean, somehow I'm not even sure if I'm fully ready yet, because I know my capabilities. I know I can't say better because I'm trying to stay humble, but make no mistake, I can hold my own. But then again, if I say that, someone's probably going to want to challenge me. But I've really gone off on a bit of a tangent, haven't I? I started with what is a martial art, now I'm at should you do martial arts. I think you should at least try. Challenge yourself to at least try a martial art, even if it is just going to the YMCA for one of their Taekwondo classes or something. I don't know what they actually do at the YMCA. It's probably like a sport Taekwondo or something. Even if it's just to get fit, even if you're planning on devoting your life to this. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to devote my life to this. I'm not an oracle. If I was, it would be no fun. But when you start that journey, you really are like making a commitment, unless you aren't. And if you do make that commitment, it's very much worth it if you see it through. If you do ever one day put on that black belt, I challenge you to think of whether or not that was worth it. And I challenge you to tell me, I wish I didn't do this. Because about 1%, less than 1% of the people who ever start the martial arts end up with a first degree black belt. So if you get that first degree black belt, you've already gone farther than 99% of the people who ever have donned a belt or equivalent thereof, if you're like in wushu, like a sash. Because wushu, or generally, when I refer to the martial art of Kung Fu, I'm going to call it wushu because that's the actual name of the art. Kung Fu literally just means to have skill. So anybody can have Kung Fu technically, but the martial art is called wushu. Now then, when you're doing this, when you're in this journey, it's going to be hell for a while. Like, there's going to be points where you hate your instructor. I know I've been there. There's going to be points where you don't want to walk through that door. I've had them, but I've never regretted walking through the door to where I train. I may have not wanted to step through that door, but I've never actually regretted walking through that door once I walk out. So, one of my earlier points was that martial art just means military art. It's derived from a militaristic force or a defensive force, whether to conquer or prevent conquest. For example, in karate or the weapon system Kobudo, it was pioneered on the island of Okinawa, south of Japan. The Okinawan farmers and fishermen developed karate, or at the time it was called Te in their native language. Karate was kind of an adaptation to get the Japanese to accept the martial art. They later adopted the belt system of judo and jiu-jitsu for that same purpose. But anyways, when they created Te, it was to prevent them from being conquered by the samurai. They repurposed their fishing implements, they repurposed their farming tools, and turned them into weapons. For example, the nunchaku used to be, it is theorized that the nunchaku were used to knock fruit down from trees. It is also generally accepted, I believe, that the tonfa, also sometimes known as a nightstick, was first the handle on a grain milling wheel. The three-pronged sai, I think that was the only one that wasn't specifically a tool at first, but I couldn't tell you for sure because I don't remember that one off the top of my head. The nunte was a fishing spear that they used to block staves and swords with the hooked ends, because there's on a nunte there's a hook that like this and a hook like that and then a point. And they used it to fish. They learned to use their fishing nets as defensive implements to throw them on people and poke them with the nunte. Also, when you go into the martial arts, you'll notice a lot of similarities between arts, mostly because of globalization. And that really is just a product of the connected world that we now live in. For example, if I take the Filipino martial arts, like say Eskrima, Kali, modern Arnis, there used to be very stark differences between them, but now you'll probably see that they teach about the same techniques. but with just different emphases. For example, karate and taekwondo, they teach the same punches and the same kicks, just with different foci. Taekwondo will focus like 90% on kicks. Karate will focus maybe 70% on hand techniques, because Taekwondo, I mean, their emphasis on the foot derives from the fact that a foot is far more powerful and has a lot more reach than your hand. And karate might focus more on hand techniques because the hand is often faster than the foot, depending on who's trained in what. Even so, they teach the same techniques, karate and taekwondo, just with different focuses, and that's just because, geographically speaking, Korea and Japan are rather close to each other, and with globalization as it is now, it's even easier to blend the two together. A karate guy like myself has gone to a taekwondo tournament and taken second place before, in their sparring and in their forms. You'll often see again with the Filipino martial arts, for example, you'll often see differences and similarities within, between the Tabosa Kali and say Doce Pares, also known as 12 pairs. You're going to see similarities. Your your basic striking pattern might be similar, but there might be a different emphasis. There might be for Tabosa Kali, you're aiming for collarbone, rib cage, solar plexus. In, say, another style, not necessarily Doce Pares, you might be aiming for head, neck, sternum. That really depends on who you ask. The Philippines is a big place, and there's a lot of islands. One island's eskrima was probably once very different from the neighboring island's eskrima. But with how much the world is connected now, the FMA, as it's sometimes called, Filipino martial arts, have really kind of blended into this big umbrella that is the modern Kali, eskrima, arnis, whatever you prefer to call it. And for the record, I do prefer the spelling of E-S-K-R-I-M-A than E-S-C-R-I-M-A, even though the studio I train at uses the C. It's kind of peeved me for a while, but frankly I'm not going to bring that up to them because, I mean, the sign is probably bloody expensive to replace. Anyways, even in Western arts like Savate and Dutch kickboxing, you're going to see a lot of similarities between them and maybe a few differences on what they're focused on. I mean, Europe is, geographically much smaller than Asia, so that's why you see more differences. And even Oceania, with entire places being separated by water. I mean, make no mistake, water is really annoying, but we all need it. And I can get into all sorts of rage about salt water and just the very fact that it exists, but that's not what I'm doing a show on. When you're doing, say, a martial art that focuses on weapons as much as empty hand, like eskrima, because in eskrima they often teach you weapon techniques first. They often teach you the stick techniques and the knife techniques before they teach you empty hand. And the point of them is that they all flow together. Like, you can do with a stick what you can do with a knife, what you can do with your empty hand or a machete or a spear or a staff. They can all kind of coexist amongst each other and do the same techniques. Some martial arts, you have like a technique with the staff, take that staff away. You can't exactly do that with your empty hands, but in eskrima, you smack them with your stick, you lose your stick, alright, now I'll just chop you in the collarbones. And that's the emphasis on eskrima. Everything flows into itself, unless you start using the crisp blade. That's so weird. Crisp blades are weird. It's like a really weird, delicate motion because those things are often poisoned too, but that's a whole other thing. And I think I've gotten pretty much most of that covered as far as like what is a martial art versus what is a sport. But I could spend a little more time on that, I suppose, because sports can derive from the martial arts, but can martial arts derive from sports? Because can you take a principle that you learn in a sport and apply it to a martial art? Sure, you can. Like, you can take the principles of tackling somebody in football and say apply that to a wrestling match or a pancration match with such grappling. But even so, it's a bit of you run the bit of a risk, because football tackles are like these giant full on, and if you miss, you're just gonna go flying over there like a bay. But sports, whatever sport that does have an inherent risk of injury in by the hands or feet of another person, probably derived its initial techniques and ways that it got about doing things from martial arts. But I could take that strike that I learned in a fencing class, in like a sport fencing class with a saber. I could take that and use it with like a dagger, like a double-sided dagger. I could. So, for example, if in fencing I do this strike, I can probably easily do that strike again with a dagger. If you were trained by the Italians, maybe you hide that dagger behind your back, and you're just like, oh yes, I'm fencing you very well. No offense to the Italians, they make great rapiers. Make no mistake, they look great. Like, yeah, moving on. You have these martial arts. You have these sports that derive from them. I mean, I can't really consider the blending too much. I don't want to go too far into the whole everything is one, all is one, because that's like a whole ideology that I don't necessarily follow unless I do. I just question my entire existence. Even so, the martial arts versus the sports. Where is that line drawn? Probably at application, would be my guess. I mean, what you're using it for at the time, because you can use a technique that you learn in a sport. You can use sport wrestling stuff on the street. You can, because that stuff will still choke somebody out or break their arm or dislocate their shoulder 3 different ways. But using the martial arts in a sport can often get you booted off the field. So I would say the line, if there is a line, if there even is like a definitive line, it's just where you're using it, because you can use one for the other, one the other for the other, in theory, which does play into the all is one sort of conundrum. Thank you for watching this week's episode of Knowledge Talk with me, Greg Laurel. If you want to keep yourself updated on episodes and never miss one, do go ahead and click that subscribe button below. If you got suggestions, comments, or even questions for me regarding the show's topic, or just about me in general, go ahead and leave a comment. I'm probably watching. So until next week, may warrior and scholar come together and help each other to return home in great victory.